Hey there, curious minds. Welcome to How It Got This Way, the podcast where we dig into the fascinating stories behind the ordinary things that shape our world.
I'm Milo.
And I'm Leah, and today we're talking about something that might seem incredibly mundane, but it's actually this fascinating window into class politics, urban development, and how we define what counts as civilized behavior.
We're talking about noise ordinances. You know, those laws that say you can't blast music after 10 p.m. or rev your motorcycle engine in a residential neighborhood.
Exactly. And when you really start digging into how these laws came about, it's this incredible story about who gets to decide what sounds are acceptable and who doesn't.
Right. So let's start with the basics. Before noise ordinances existed, cities were just loud, right?
Oh, incredibly loud. I mean, if you think about cities in the 1800s and early 1900s, you've got horses and carriages clattering over cobblestones, street vendors shouting their wares, blacksmiths hammering away, church bells ringing at all hours. And then the Industrial Revolution kicks in, and suddenly you've got steam engines, factory whistles, machinery running day and night. Cities were essentially 24-hour noise machines.
Right. And for most people, that was just life. You didn't really have a choice but to deal with it.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. The first real push for noise regulation came from doctors and what we would call the emerging middle and upper classes. And this was around the 1900s to 1920s.
Doctors were involved?
Oh, yeah. So there was this growing medical understanding that excessive noise could actually damage your health. They started talking about something called noise disease or auditory nerve fatigue. There was this famous New York physician named Dr. John Harvey Kellogg.
Wait, Kellogg? Like the cereal guy?
Yeah, that's his brother. John Harvey was the medical guy. Will Keith was the serial entrepreneur. But anyway, John Harvey was writing about how city noise was literally making people sick. He claimed it caused insomnia, nervous breakdowns, even digestive problems.
And people bought into this?
Well, certain people did. And here's where the class politics really start to show up. The people who had the political power to actually do something about noise were the people who could afford to live in quieter neighborhoods or who worked in professions where concentration and quiet were valued.
Right. So, like lawyers, doctors, business owner.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the working class people who are actually creating a lot of the noise, the street vendors, the factory workers, the construction crews, they didn't have much say in the matter, and their livelihoods often depended on activities that the new laws would restrict.
So, when did the first actual noise ordinances get passed?
The earliest ones I could find were around 1907 to 1910. New York was one of the pioneers, which makes sense because it was so densely populated and had all these competing interests cramming into the same space.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. These early laws were super vague. They would say things like unnecessary noise or disturbing the peace. There were no decibel measurements, no specific time restrictions. It was basically up to police officers to decide what counted as too loud.
Though that's super subjective.
Totally subjective. And guess whose complaints got taken seriously and whose didn't? There's this fascinating case study from 1915 in Chicago where wealthy residents of the Gold Coast neighborhood successfully got a street musician ordinance passed that basically banned poor immigrant street performers.
That's pretty bland.
Was. And the language they used was all about maintaining the character of the neighborhood and protecting property values. But really, it was criminalizing the survival strategies of poor people.
Right, because a lot of these street musicians, they weren't just performing for fun. This was how they made money.
Exactly. And it wasn't just musicians. Street vendors who called out their goods, knife sharpeners with their bells, even kids playing loud games in the street. All of this became potentially criminal behavior under these new laws.
So there was this really interesting figure who opposed a lot of these early noise ordinances. Have you heard of Julia Lathrop?
No, tell me about her.
She was this progressive era reformer who worked with poor immigrants in Chicago. And she wrote these really insightful pieces about how noise ordinances were basically being used as tools of class warfare. She pointed out that the same wealthy people who were complaining about street vendors were perfectly fine with the noise from their own construction projects and private parties.
Oh, that's such a good point.
Right? She argued that noise ordinances were selectively enforced based on who was making the noise and what their social status was, not on any objective measure of actual disturbance.
That's still true today, isn't it? Like, think about how differently police respond to noise complaints about a house party in a wealthy suburb versus a barbecue in a predominantly Black or Latino neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. But let me tell you about this wild period in the 1920s, because that's when things really got intense. Have you heard about the Noise Abatement Commission?
No, what was that?
So in 1929, New York City created this official commission to study and combat noise. And they went all out. They had sound measurement devices, they mapped noise levels across different neighborhoods, they held public hearings.
That sounds very scientific.
It was. And it was led by this fascinating character named Dr. Edward Evans, who was both a physician and an acoustics researcher. He was convinced that noise was one of the major public health threats of the modern age.
What did they find?
Well, they documented that the loudest areas were predictably the poorest areas, near factories, train yards, busy commercial districts where working class people lived. But here's the kicker. Instead of addressing the root causes like industrial pollution or inadequate housing, they focused almost entirely on individual behaviors.
So, like, stop being so loud instead of maybe factories shouldn't be right next to apartment buildings.
Exactly. They went after car horns, street vendors, children playing, people talking loudly on the street. But industrial noise, construction noise during business hours, that was just accepted as the natural sound of progress.
That's such a perfect example of how these laws reflect whose comfort and convenience matters. The commission was basically saying that poor people need to be quieter, but rich people's business activities can be as loud as they want.
Right. And there's this really telling moment from the commission's records. They got a complaint about a wealthy businessman's private jazz party that was keeping an entire neighborhood awake. But instead of citing him, they recommended that the neighbors invest in better windows and soundproofing.
Oh my God, that's incredible. It's not our fault for being loud, it's your fault for having cheap windows.
Exactly. Meanwhile, that same week, they fined 3 street vendors for shouting about their goods.
You know what else is interesting about this period? Cars were becoming more common, and car noise became this huge battleground for noise ordinances.
Oh, yeah, the honking wars.
The honking wars. So in the 1920s and 30s, car horns were like aggressively loud, and people used them constantly, not just for safety, but as a way to express frustration, to greet friends, to celebrate.
Like a whole language of honking.
Right, and this created this fascinating class conflict because cars were still pretty expensive. So most car owners were middle class or wealthy, but they were also creating noise that affected everyone, including the wealthy people who lived along major roads.
Though for once, the wealthy noisemakers were annoying other wealthy people.
Exactly. And that's when you started to see really specific, enforceable noise ordinances, like no honking except for emergencies, specific fines for excessive use of car horns, even restrictions on engine modifications that made cars louder.
Because suddenly it wasn't just poor people being loud, it was people with actual political power.
Yes, and you could see the difference in how these laws were written and enforced. The anti-honking ordinances had clear standards, reasonable penalties, and they applied equally to everyone, unlike the vague, disturbing the peace laws that were used to target street vendors and musicians.
That's such a clear example of how the law works differently depending on who it affects.
Totally. And then World War II happened and everything changed again. Suddenly, industrial noise was patriotic. Factories running 24/7 to support the war effort, air raid sirens, military vehicles. Nobody was complaining about noise when it was for defeating fascism.
Right, context matters so much for what we consider acceptable noise.
And then, in the 1950s and 60s, you get suburban development and noise ordinances become this tool for maintaining racial and class segregation. Suburbs marketed themselves as quiet, peaceful havens away from the noise and chaos of urban life.
And urban life was often code for Black and immigrant communities.
Exactly. And suburban noise ordinances became incredibly strict. No loud music, no gatherings after certain hours, no commercial activities, even restrictions on children playing outside during certain times.
These rules basically enforced a very specific white middle class lifestyle as the legal standard.
Right. And if you think about many traditional African American, Latino, or immigrant communities, they often have more communal, outdoor oriented social patterns. Street life, block parties, extended family gatherings, music as a central part of daily life. All of that became potentially criminal under these new ordinances. And when those communities did move to suburbs, they often faced harassment and citations for behavior that was perfectly normal in their previous neighborhoods.
It's like the law was designed to make certain ways of living illegal.
That's exactly what it was. And then in the 1970s, you get the introduction of scientific noise measurement, decibel meters, specific time restrictions, measurable standards. This was supposed to make noise ordinances more objective and fair.
Did it work?
Sort of, but not really. Having objective standards definitely helped reduce some of the most blatant discrimination, but enforcement was still subjective. Police departments still decided which complaints to investigate, which neighborhoods to patrol, who to believe when there were disputes.
Plus, the standards themselves weren't necessarily neutral. Who decided what decibel level was reasonable? What times were acceptable for different activities?
Exactly. These decisions were still being made by predominantly white, middle-class city councils and planning committees. So the standards reflected their preferences and lifestyles, just with more scientific-sounding justifications.
And I think this brings us to today because noise ordinances are still this fascinating battleground for so many urban conflicts.
Oh, absolutely. Think about gentrification, right? New residents move into historically Black or Latino neighborhoods and then start complaining about music from local businesses, street vendors, community gatherings, things that have been part of the neighborhood culture for decades.
Right. And they use noise ordinances as a tool to reshape the neighborhood to fit their preferences.
And it's the same basic pattern we've been seeing for over a century. People with more political and economic power use noise ordinances to control the behavior of people with less power, all while claiming it's just about maintaining reasonable standards.
What's wild to me is how this whole history shows that there's no such thing as neutral or objective standards for noise. Every decision about what's too loud or when or where reflects someone's values and priorities.
Totally. And it makes you think about sound differently, right? Like, sound is never just sound. It's always embedded in these bigger questions about who belongs, who has power, what kind of community we want to live in.
Yeah, every time you hear someone complaining about noise, there's probably a deeper conversation happening about class, race, culture, and belonging.
And that's why the seemingly boring topic, noise ordinances, actually tells us so much about how cities work, how laws are made and enforced, and how power operates in everyday life. And you know what's fascinating about modern enforcement? Social media has completely changed how noise complaints work. Now people can document noise violations with their phones, post them online, and create public pressure that didn't exist before.
It's like a perfect example of how the ordinary world is never actually ordinary when you dig into how it got this way.
Seems like social media could actually be helpful in cases like this to document what's happening.
Right, but it's interesting because it also depends on whose documentation gets taken seriously. A wealthy neighborhood's video of a loud party might go viral and lead to immediate police response, while a low-income community's documentation of industrial noise pollution might get ignored.
Exactly. That's our whole thing here. Nothing is as simple as it seems on the surface.
Yep. And it reminds me of this case study I read about Portland, where they tried to reform their noise ordinances to be more culturally sensitive. They actually had community listening sessions where different neighborhoods could discuss what noise levels were acceptable to them.
Oh, that's interesting. How did that work out?
Well, it was really enlightening, but also complicated. Different communities had wildly different perspectives. Some neighborhoods wanted strict quiet hours because residents worked early shifts. Others wanted flexibility for weekend celebrations and cultural events. The Latino communities pointed out that their traditional celebrations often involve music and gathering in ways that the existing ordinances basically criminalized.
And I bet the solution they came up with still had to make compromises that probably didn't satisfy everyone.
You got it. They ended up creating these zone-based ordinances where different neighborhoods could have different standards based on their community input. But even that created new problems, like what happens when someone moves from a louder zone to a quieter one and doesn't know about the different rules. And it still required enforcement, which meant police officers making judgment calls on cultural context.
This makes me think about how construction noise gets handled so differently from other types of noise. Like if your neighbor has a loud party on Saturday night, that's a violation. But if there's jackhammering outside your apartment at 7 a.m. on Saturday for some private construction project, that's just business as usual.
Right, and construction noise is often much louder and more disruptive than social noise. But it gets this automatic legitimacy because it's considered productive activity. There's this assumption that economic activity always trumps residential comfort.
And there's this whole other dimension with leaf blowers that I find completely fascinating. They're basically the perfect symbol of how noise ordinances reflect class and labor dynamics.
Okay, don't even get me started on leaf blower.
Fair enough, I won't go there. This is probably a good place to wrap up for today. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the surprisingly political history of noise ordinances. If you have ideas for future episodes about the ordinary things you want to understand better, drop us a comment and let us know. We love hearing from you and getting your suggestions.
We'll see you next time when we dig into another fascinating story about how our everyday world got this way. Until then, keep questioning the ordinary.